Deus Ex is a game that finds itself on a lot of best game of all time lists, uttered in the same breath as Half-Life or Super Metroid. And as far as impact is concerned, Deus Ex has had an equal, if not greater one on the overall gaming landscape. But up until the relatively recent modern reimaginings of the series, Deus Ex was a title that had kind of fallen out of gaming's collective consciousness, especially for those not deeply entrenched in the PC side of it. And that's because Deus Ex is a quintessentially PC game. While it was eventually ported to consoles with a surprisingly uncompromised PS2 version, every single bit of its design ethos is what you would expect from a PC game in the vein of Thief or System Shock, offering massive amounts of openness and freedom to play the game however you want, from how you spec your characters, stats, and equipment, to how you take on each level. If you can figure out a way to achieve a goal or objective and there isn't a physical obstacle stopping you, you can do it. Deus Ex has no interest in forcing you to perform an objective exactly how the game designer expected you to. Modern games have become so obsessed with playtesting out any abnormality that only the things they know for a fact will work when the game ships, and any unintended methods you might find to achieve your goals, they'll eventually patch out. Deus Ex puts a certain amount of trust in the player, a modicum of faith that they can get themselves out of just about any mess they put themselves into. This method of game design can certainly lead to the player backing themselves into an inescapable corner at times, but for me, I'd rather take the mildly janky openness over the more linear, polished experience, because what still sets this original Deus Ex apart even 16 years later is the amount of freedom that it gives you. In that one respect, games still haven't really come all that far. In fact, because of the endless polishing and streamlining a lot of modern games undergo, most of them have slid backwards in that regard. That said, modern games have made a lot of strides in other areas in the last decade and a half, and both the gameplay and visuals of Deus Ex have aged rather poorly. Even when it was new, Deus Ex didn't look particularly fantastic, but these days it can kind of be painful to look at, and the clunky controls don't really help you to ignore the graphical fidelity all that much. For me, the controls were relatively okay since I tend to take a very stealthy approach, avoiding conflict if at all possible, but if at any point you're forced into it, even the non-lethal stealthy type stuff, you'll very quickly realize the game was simply not built to handle that sort of thing. However, both the freedom the game allows you and the surprisingly well-crafted, if a bit conspiracy-laden narrative, supply you with plenty of fuel to keep you interested for the game's duration, despite its flaws. But if those flaws end up being a bit too much for you, and I really can't blame you, some really fantastic mods have sprung up over the last few years that make this classic much easier to stomach. Now, instead of trying to stitch together a whole bunch of disparate mods to improve your experience, I would highly recommend you pick up one of two big mods, either GMDX or Deus Ex Revision. Now, these two mods take very different approaches to how the game should be modernized. GMDX takes the mostly traditional update route, a relatively mechanical approach to improving the game, tweaking gameplay, and generally making the game feel better while making some minor improvements to the graphics, fixing a slew of bugs that have popped up on modern systems, and improving the interface in some small but noticeable ways. But all the environments remain the exact same that they were in the base game. On the other hand, Revision completely overhauls the game into something different and surprisingly new, making major modifications to environments, which can sometimes very much affect how you need to approach certain missions. Even seemingly small changes like adding a new structure or a locked gate can change things a whole lot. As such, I would highly recommend GMDX for your first playthrough if you want a more modern experience. Its mechanical tweaks do a pretty great job of making the game much more playable, while still maintaining the traditional world of Deus Ex. But for a second playthrough, Deus Ex Revision is a fascinating and incredibly in-depth remake of the game, one that I think is probably better appreciated if you've played the game before. But no matter how you choose to play Deus Ex, you really should play it. It represents what is somewhat of a lost art in the world of game design, knowing how to create a world where the player feels free to do whatever they want. And I don't just mean having a big world where the player can do a few things, a sort of illusion of freedom, because as soon as you toss them into a mission, there's only one way to do it. No, what you need to do is you give them the ability to use any tool in their disposal any way they want, without any artificial limitations. And even 16 years after its release, Deus Ex is still the master of that school of game design. Every Monday, I look at a game that's at least 10 years old, what I would consider to be retro, and I see if it's held up today, if it's still worth playing now. If you like that idea, be sure to subscribe so you can see the latest videos. If you like this video in particular, be sure to hit that like button, and thanks for watching.